Hi, Rob Lambert here. Today I'm going to be taking on a very complicated, very important issue. And I'm going to be taking it on very quickly at a very shallow level, just discussing some of the key issues. And the reason I'm doing it and, and, uh, and giving you this overview is because this is a question I'm constantly being asked by my serial entrepreneurs, by my inventors, by my software engineers. I have clients that just invent something new every 2 or 3 years, and it's almost always intellectual property, and it almost always needs protection, and almost always the first time they do it, they make 1 or 2 fundamental mistakes. So don't expect to learn anything about how to actually do this, but expect to learn or hear at least some of the key issues, and mostly take it with you that you need a real expert here. And actually, the taxation of intellectual property is a whole level of expertise. It's a life study to be good at it, just that little issue. Same with patent and copyright and protecting intellectual property by registering the property with the various countries that offer protection, some of which don't, you know. Also, there's the issue with treaties we're going to be talking about. That's another subspecialty. It's a whole life study. So don't think that any one person or one group knows it all. But I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview and enough information so that you should be able to ask some intelligent questions. And here's the outline I'll be speaking from. This outline is available underneath this video. If you want to print it out, it's a good place to take notes. And again, I'm going to repeat, this is going to be short. This could be 4 or 5 year-long courses in a law school, and you're going to get it in probably 5 more minutes. What do I mean by intellectual property? That's, that's debated, people discuss it. I'm talking about things like software or know-how, something that is special that you invented. Oftentimes it's patentable, sometimes it's just secrets. But what is almost always the case is the intellectual property that allows something to be done can almost always be separated from the business that profits from the intellectual property. And why is that important? Well, the intellectual property can almost always be owned offshore but licensed to every country in which it is used. And let me give you an example. Let's just say, and this is pretty close to a true case. Let's just say you invented some software that allowed you to copy DVDs. And let's just say that your software was becoming the hot thing. You invented it in your garage one summer, and a little bit before Christmas, it caught on. The newspapers started talking about it, and your orders became huge. And naturally, the motion picture organization started suing. Well, what should have happened? What should have happened is the intellectual property, the software that enabled the DVDs to be easily copied, should have been both developed and owned offshore. It should be developed and owned offshore to keep it safe from the many predators that exist in the United States that will always try to take it away. And it should be owned and licensed from abroad because in many cases these intellectual property assets have a worldwide value, not just in the United States. There could be a bigger market in China or Germany or Japan or South Africa than even in the United States. So it's almost always better, both from an asset protection and a tax perspective, and we'll talk about that briefly in a few minutes, to have your intellectual property owned offshore. And what is a typical structure to own it? Well, the most typical structure is a straight-ahead asset protection trust. It is very common for people to put their intellectual property, their code, their URLs. By the way, with your URLs, your web page addresses, those always should be owned offshore, and they always should be proxy registered so they don't directly lead to you. They need to be proxy registered with a company that doesn't share the information with U.S. judges and lawyers. That's pretty easy to do. A little bit of work, a little bit of research on the internet will get you to the right places. But the typical structure is a straight ahead asset protection trust. And often the trust, well, not often, but sometimes the trust will actually own the entities that hold the software. Sometimes those entities will be actually insurance companies that hold subsidiaries that own the software or own the intellectual property. There's 100 different ways to choose or to set up the ownership. But as long as it's offshore and off your balance sheet, your intellectual property will be a lot more protected than if you just owned it in the United States. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the major issues. First one is getting your intellectual property offshore. Let's go back to my example about the guys who came up with something to pirate DVDs. Well, if they put the property offshore before it has any value, before it's protected, before it's developed, and indeed, even better, they develop it completely offshore, then the act of transferring it offshore should not create a major U.S. tax problem. But if your client or if the person waits until the asset has real value, there's potential disastrous tax consequences. Why? Well, see Section 367 down there. If you look at it, 367 taxes the person or the entity that transfers intellectual property or indeed any business asset abroad as if it were a sale or exchange. There's a big toll tax to pay if you transfer your assets offshore when the intellectual property is fully developed. The IRS has 20/20 hindsight. They can wait 2-3 years after you do the transfers and say, oh, well, this software was worth $82 million. We know you didn't think it was worth anything when you did it, but you've been making XYZ dollars every month for the last 2.5 years. This is incredibly valuable, and we're going to tax you as if you sold an $82 million asset with lower or no basis. And they will impose a tax on you, they will impose penalties, and they will basically tax you out of existence if you do this incorrectly or at the wrong time. You always need to be aware of when and how you put your money offshore. One way around that issue is sometimes using an insurance structure way beyond the course or the focus of this particular course. There are ways to potentially mitigate against 367 harm. And I mentioned 482 right under 367 because this is a provision that will catch you if you're not careful. 482 deals with transfer pricing. It means that you need to have fair pricing, arm's length pricing. And oftentimes these, when you put your property offshore, you'll structure, or the clients will attempt to structure royalty arrangements where they license the property in such a way as to maximize the profits offshore and eliminate profits onshore. If you can't get too aggressive on that, 482 is a big issue with the IRS. They don't usually see it with normal companies. It's usually into the multi-million or billion-dollar pricing issues. And 482 studies are a big deal with big companies. It doesn't usually hit human beings. But go back to my pigs get eaten lecture. Don't be unfair. Be intelligent. And for heaven's sakes, if you're doing this, this is never do it yourself. This is get a really major, well-trained tax lawyer, tax accountant combo and integrate it with your business people and do this early on. Don't wait until you're ready to go. And the problem is you're oftentimes poor working in your garage. You come up with a great idea. It needs to be owned offshore and you can't afford to figure out how to get it offshore. Well, in those cases still, grit your teeth, spend a few dollars on good advice, and for heaven's sakes, get it offshore and develop it offshore if it isn't too late. And that's something that is a case-by-case decision, but I wanted you to be aware of it because keeping it offshore will not only protect you, but there are some really neat little tax issues that can help you or hurt you. See the word CFC? That stands for Controlled Foreign Corporation. Well, if you put your offshore asset your offshore intellectual property into a controlled foreign corporation or a non-controlled foreign corporation, you're going to have very distinct tax consequences. Normally, with a non-controlled foreign corporation, you can isolate your offshore income almost forever offshore. You won't have to pay taxes on it at the U.S. level until you take it out in the form of a dividend, or if you take it out in the form of salary. That's normal. What is a controlled foreign corporation? Again, this is a huge topic. This is a whole career just to deal in CFCs. But controlled foreign corporations are defined as corporations in which a person known as a U.S. shareholder owns 10%, or U.S. shareholders own 50% or more of the total combined voting power of the company. And if U.S. shareholders, and those are people that own 10% or more, together own more than 50%, then the income at the controlled foreign corporation level is taxed directly to the U.S. shareholders as it's earned, whether or not it's distributed. And there are a lot of exceptions to it. And if the CFC is engaged in a full-bore trader business like manufacturing, making telephones, and putting, some widget together, you oftentimes can avoid the tax that is on undistributed net operating income at the CFC level. This is a huge topic, hugely complex, way beyond the scope or way inappropriate to go into on this site, but I want you all to know about it. And again, I mention insurance companies because sometimes forming an offshore insurance company and electing to be treated as a U.S. insurance company allows you to get your assets offshore, get the protection you have offshore without a 367 problem. You don't always want to do it, and I know I'm talking numbers, so it probably doesn't make sense. Now, I'm also going to mention two other things. FDAP and ECI. FDAP is just shorthand for the offshore company being taxed on U.S. income as if it was just a passive investment, just a royalty income. It's usually a tax of 30% at gross withheld or collected by the payor. That's normally the U.S. side of the business at the source. It's a 30% tax on the gross. There is no deduction for business expenses. But if the company is engaged in a real trade or business in the United States, it's taxed pretty much as a normal U.S. company. It's called ECI, effectively connected income, effectively connected with a trade or business. And if you have that, it is taxable, but you get to take off your normal deductions and you're taxed at normal corporate rates. All of this alphabet soup is hopefully confusing you enough so that you become highly convinced that you need to worry about it and you need to get expert help if you go down this direction. And the last thing I wanted to point out is treaties are extremely valuable. If you know you're going to be selling this asset through a company associated with the Netherlands, you might want to form or to put your offshore IP in the Netherlands Antilles. Why? Because there's some really good tax treaties that allow you to reduce your tax impact. Treaties are, again, a whole life's work. Nobody knows CFCs and treaties. Nobody knows FDAP 367, 482 enough to do this on their own. You really do need a team approach, and unfortunately, many of you who are serial entrepreneurs will not be able to afford it. But don't be remiss. Don't think it doesn't matter. There's nothing more sad, except seeing somebody have no money, than to see somebody make an awful lot of money and find that they're going to be paying tax on their worldwide income to Uncle Sam at a pretty high rate when they could have cut that tax in half or even less by moving abroad at the same time, fully disclosing, letting Uncle Sam and all the relevant tax authorities know everything. I'm not talking about any wink, nod, cheat, or hide the ball, but with full disclosure and full compliance, you can reduce your taxes dramatically if you think about it before you do it. Well, I hope this is helpful to my serial entrepreneurs. For the normal people out there, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much.